All right, is everyone back? Everyone knows where we are on Friday and where we'll be having lunch. All right, so let's continue. So we've observed, right, that institutions are important for encouraging investments, encouraging economic growth, encouraging human capital accumulation as well. But we still find this issue with why is it that some institutions in other countries are better than in others, right? So firstly, from the above correlations, strong institutions can lower, weak institutions, we've already discussed this, weak institutions can lower productivity by misallocating labor and capital in the economy, right? So you can literally have two countries with similar rates of accumulating physical capital, with similar labor force size, but they follow different paths, right? So if you take two neighboring countries like North Korea, South Korea, at some point they were on the same trajectory. If you do the time trend, the year trend of North Korea and South Korea, they're literally on top of each other, if not one. And then at some point, South Korea outpaces North Korea, right? So these were two economies that had similar factors, growth factors in place, but they took different paths. Because the economic environments in which the production processes were taking place, they changed. Something happened and it shifted. It was good for North Korea. It was good for South Korea. It didn't work for North Korea. So maybe in one capital, in one economy, capital was then used to fend off crime. Maybe in one economy, there was internal conflict, and then that capital had to be used, had to be taken out of those economic sectors that were growing the economy to protect or to take care of this internal strife, right? So that capital is then being used to fend off other issues within this economy, while in the neighboring economy, they have continued. We are assuming, obviously, holding the fact that there's no spillover from the conflict, because we know that conflict usually spills over into neighboring countries. Yes.
Just to add to that, South Korea has a lot of American influence. So after the war, the U.S. military invested a lot in South Korea.
Yes, and North Korea remained a closed economy, right? And if you think then you can find that in another country, all the capital that they have is being used for productive activities, right? So if you were to compare maybe Brazil with Germany, at some point Brazil was doing really well, but then, for whatever reasons, the crime rates increased. So now you find the economy or the government is having to deal with these issues. So that's quite a fair amount of the capital that's now going to deal with the crime rates, whereas Germany is continuing to use most of their capital to grow the economy, right? And you find all these sort of case study evidences plotted across the world, right? And also sometimes your capital is meant to be directed at the more efficient sectors. So again, I mentioned this, that in some countries, state-owned companies become the sector that gets most of the investments. And yet this state-owned company is not producing or providing the public services, yet it continuously gets subsidies from the government to remain or to stay operational, yet, but they are being inefficient. In countries where the institutions are strong, that state-owned company would be replaced with a more efficient company. So this is where being open to competition is important, because if you're in a country where competition is being stifled, those inefficient companies will continue to operate. Whereas ideally, if you just let more efficient companies or entry into this sector of new businesses that are more efficient. If you'd allow that, you would find that you are characterized by more efficient businesses that are conducive to the economic progress of your country. So why is it that we find that institutions in some countries are better than others, right? And I do like Douglas North's quote that he says governments are not, if we believe, he says don't think that they are, but governments are not benevolent social planners seeking to maximize the welfare of citizens in society, but they are self-interested and they are utility maximizing agents, just like any other human being. Our incentive is to maximize our utility, right? That's the economics definition that we are taught in 101 economics. Individuals want to maximize their utility, firms want to maximize profits. Our leaders or the people that we are putting in power, they are humans like us. They also want to maximize their utility. But what we are interested in is, while they are maximizing their utility, is it at the expense of the country? Because that's where the problem comes, right? We all want to have a good life. So we are not going to deny our leaders a good life. But if your good life is now infringing on my good life, that's where now we've got an issue. So unfortunately, some countries just have bad people within their governments or bad leadership. And we do have evidence of that. So, and you do have cases where you can, even though you may have a bad leader, but if the country has strong institutions, or if the people surrounding you still believe in the laws and the regulations, they can constrain you. Right? And then you find that your country survives that term of the leader, right? So we saw that with the States, that they had Trump, but the constraints, the constitution was strong, such that, if he was infringing on human rights or anything, he was pulled back. And you could tell that there were some executive decisions he would make during that first term that he would then come back and say, oh, no, we're not going through with that, right? It meant that there were people that were advising him and telling him, this is not good. These are the implications. And he was listening, right? As we said, he's a businessman. So he knew that, okay, maybe if I'm stubborn and I do this, it's going to impinge on my utility maximizing ability. So let me back off, right? So you can have countries where you can have an autocratic leader, but the country is still growing. But if you have a leader who is, who really doesn't care about the welfare of his citizens, who doesn't care about laws or regulations, and who is smart enough to capture the key arms of the government, your police, your army, your justice, your courts, then you're in for a rocky ride during that term. And we have also observed this. Yes.
This is what we're facing as a country, as we speak. I think this is what we're facing as a country. A lot is happening and fatigues. Yeah. So it's a very good example, actually.
Yeah. So it's always going to depend, right? So I gave two examples, right? Japan put in place economic and political reforms, and, they have a leader who is interested in the well-being of the country, in growing the country. Japan have a strong culture about a community and social cohesion. And their income is 2/3 of the US income after World War II. Venezuela, one of the richest countries in 1960, is today one of the poorest because of the policy reforms that were put in place. And if you think of the people that were leading at the time, those policy reforms were really to protect the wealth of the resources that was accruing to them, not necessarily for the well-being of the country, right? So there's a famous name there. So are growth disasters man-made? That's a question I always ask my students. Do you think growth disasters are man-made? Yes. Why do you think sometimes? I would just say yes. I believe they are, because even if we think about natural disasters, right? For you to recover from a natural disaster, you need to have, institutions in place that had already been sort of forward-looking and preparing for these sort of macroeconomic or, events that might come, shocks that might happen, right? And you see that in the States. How many times are they hit by typhoons, by hurricanes in some of the states? And people will come out and say, we'll rebuild. We're going to rebuild. And they do rebuild, right? And they carry on. They get and the aid they are getting is internal aid. It's not coming. Most of it is coming from inside, right? And then you've got a neighboring island, Haiti, which also gets hit by a natural disaster, and they haven't recovered.
To add to that, Japan is also like earthquake prone.
Prone, yes. And they carry on, and they're still a powerful economy today. Yes.
And another thing that you can also consider, if you check, in every 10 years, there's an event happening.
Yeah, exactly, And some countries are able to recover, others not. Is it the institutions that are in place? The quality of institutions capture the role of governments, right? And what we've seen is that economies with weak institutions, they will implement policies that may discourage investments, and this in turn harms economic growth. But why do such changes in institutions take place within countries? And sometimes it's quite difficult to get a tangible answer to this, but it's most likely the political economic environment in the country, the political economic environment in the country. And lately, there's been a lot of literature and evidence coming out about how economic history is playing a critical role in us understanding the development parts of countries that were affected by historical shocks, and how when we implement our policies, we need to acknowledge these historical events to ensure that the policies are actually going to be effective in addressing the problem that we are trying to deal with, right? So this brings us to African development and the historical legacies. So I did put a very long paper, but that paper is really great. It came out 2020 by Michalopoulos and Papiano. They do a lot as well within historical institutions. But what they do in this paper is they summarize all the literature. So if you want to see where the various literature that's linked to economic history in Africa, that paper is a quick reference point, and you can then just look at which paper you want to read at. But in this paper, they look at several historical legacies that affected Africa's development path, right? So they look at the legacy of slave trades, they look at the legacy of colonial investments, they discuss pre-colonial institutions that were already in existence in Africa and how those were affected by the slave trade and the colonialism. And they also look at missionaries as well, because missionary was also another historical event that took place in Africa, which impacts the development of human capital investment. And, there's, I don't think I go into detail here. I didn't look at the missionaries aspect so much, but there is literature that looks at, where the missionaries, where the colonizers settled. You'll find that there's also a high presence of missionary schools, or missionaries were there, because the missionaries do precede the colonialism. So when they entered Africa, and they had already started setting up infrastructure for human capital, so the when the Westerners came, they kind of were drawn to where there was that kind of human capital and infrastructure in place, and then they would then work with the missionaries to continue with their agenda within that country. And there's also literature within the missionaries, if you're interested in the expansion of missionaries, on how the types of missionaries matter. So you've got Protestant missionaries, you've got Catholic missionaries. Countries where there was a higher presence of Catholic missionaries, you might find that women's human capital was delayed because they were not so much about women being educated, whereas the Protestants were a lot more liberal in terms of their institutions, right? So this is pre-colonial Africa. So much of the history we are taught today is premised on the coming of Westerners in the 15th century. And it's always argued, right, or often argued, that Africa was devoid of state institutions and there were no polities of significance, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. But contrary to these narratives, where, you know, the narrative is that Africa is largely associated with poverty and inequality, it is important to highlight that that was not the case. It was not always the case, especially if we consider the history of Africa pre-colonial and pre-slavery in Africa. So during this era, so this first graph shows the kingdoms that were in Africa, pre-colonial and pre-slavery. This was the trade that was happening in Africa during that period, and these were the trade routes. And you can see their trade routes within Africa as well, and also outside of Africa, right? So Africa was characterized by kingdoms and chiefdoms with political structures and systems to govern their populations. You had big kingdoms that are quite well known, and you also had smaller kingdoms as well. So, for example, you had the Songhai Empire. That was one of the largest states. So this is where Songhai is. And if you think of the countries today that are now part of the Songhai, so those are the largest states that dominated the Western Sahel in the 15th and 16th centuries, and they are located in parts of Mali, Niger, Nigeria, and Benin. You have other examples, including the Mali Empire, which was the largest state in West Africa, occupying parts of Mauritania, Senegal, Gambia, and Mali. So this would be right here. Your Mali kingdom would be around somewhere here. No, it's here. Yeah, there it is. There's your Mali kingdom. We also had Edo, the Edo kingdom, that is now in southern Nigeria. The kingdom of Dahomey in Benin. If you've watched The Woman King, you'll know about Dahomey. The Wagadu, they were Organa, the Wagadu Empire, located now in southeastern Mauritania and western Mali and eastern Senegal. And then you had the Asante. You know, they are very well known, big, thriving kingdom in Ghana. Then you also had the kingdom of Aksum in East Africa, Ethiopia today, Mwene Matapa in Zimbabwe, and they were covering Zimbabwe, Zambia, Botswana, and Malawi area. So can you see these kingdoms, how they were divided when the borders were put in place?
Where was South Africa in this?
Oh, the Zulu kingdom. I'm coming. I was coming. I was coming. The Zulu kingdom in southern Africa. So here you guys are.
Not the only idea.
I think Zulu is late. It's too late in terms of this. I think Mapungubwe should be.
Yes. Yeah. So no, the Zulu kingdom features, don't worry, the southern Africa is there. The Zulu kingdom features very
About mine,
oh, yeah. No, but there are a lot of examples. So if you go into the paper, I just picked a few, you know. So Zulu is there on my list. And I do say the list goes on. So the Zulu kingdom was in southern, this is interesting, it was in southern Africa, not South Africa, southern Africa, right? So it was in most of these southern countries, and the Kingdom of Congo, of course, I can't forget Central Africa as well. The list goes on, right? And what was interesting about all these states, they were in different forms of state building during this era, right? So they were expanding and they were integrating. Population groups, which brings us to what we were trading in. Population groupings, you had some states that were still involved in hunting and gathering, but some had even started transitioning into agriculture and mining. Trade also happened to be a key part of these economies regionally. Pre-colonial trade involved natural resources, agricultural goods, and manufactured goods as well. So there's even evidence in pre-colonial African trade that we were already involved in art, in writing, in maths, in medicine, astronomy, technology such as minting of coin, and I think that was in Ethiopia, if I'm not incorrect, and ship building, as Darlington told us that, we were building ships already. These were thriving economies during this particular era. Yes.
Just to also mention for the benefit of colleagues here, that the oldest library in the world is in Timbuktu, Mali, with writing, scientific, literary languages and everything. Oldest library, still maintained to this day. You can visit Timbuktu and you will see it. And then in addition to that, the oldest known minters, not minters in coins, but crafters of gold, is the kingdom I'm talking about, Mapungu, which is based here. And then the oldest kingdom that is known for stone making is in Zimbabwe, the Zimbabweans. So those I think are important to mention, because even the oldest calendar in the world is in Mpumalanga, Inzalo Yelanga is what it is called, where Africans then created a compass that is still correct to this day in terms of which direction the sun comes up, locating it through rocks, which direction it will go down, and when seasons change, there's a rock that will show you in which direction a season will change, etc. You can check that up as well. It is located in Mpumalanga. So I think it's important for the narrative that Africa was a blank slate and Europeans brought civilization to understand that that is nonsense, because historically, each and every one of these things were started, even language itself was started in South Africa. Venda is known to be one of the least evolved languages, and we have many more languages that we can trace and say even that began here.
And you know what's interesting about what you're saying is we've got this rich history, but we don't advertise it. We don't use it to our advantage for tourism, to draw people to say, come and see. This is our history. Yet we will go to Europe to look at Roman history, to look at, Viking history, to look at their World War II museums. And then we'll go to British Museum and see all our artifacts there, instead of seeing our artifacts here.
How many are also capitals?
And it is that last point that you mentioned on the British Museum, is what I wanted to add, is that the Europeans are surprised that Africans can do this. They can't produce something that
Yes.
they just take it to so they ask us to come and see it.
I was very surprised when I went to I went to Italy, and I was doing in the Sistine Chapel. You can go through. They've got all these artifacts. Obviously, they've got their paintings from their Italian artists, but they were mummies, esophaguses. There were mummies there, real life size, right? And they will say this was discovered in some area of Egypt by so and so. So I'm like, okay, fine, you discovered it there. Why don't you leave it there? They've got museums. It's their property. Why is it all the way across the ocean? I went to Great Zimbabwe. You guys must visit Great Zimbabwe. I was impressed. How they built. I mean, it's a massive area, and how they built, putting the stones together with there's no cement. Yeah. Somehow they just built this infrastructure. But when I went through, I did the tour in the museum that's there, and I think it's not advertised at all. And they've got the different, so Zimbabwe's got the bird. So they've got the different stones of the birds, and they were saying this was the first one that was made and all of that. And then there's some that are missing. And when you asked the tour guide, he was like, oh yeah, those were taken by the Europeans, by the Westerners when they went. So you'll find it in this particular museum in England or in this particular. So I'm saying, and they did ask for it back. They did ask for it back, but they were not, the answer was no.
I think Nigeria did get some historical archives back from UK a few years ago.
We can show you the we want to get to.
Yeah. So, so I think, and that's why I'm like, we've got so much history. We've got all these different places in our individual countries that we can show to the rest of the world, or even to your neighboring, or even to us from Southern Africa. I would love to go to most of the West African countries, just to see the culture there, to see what they have. But then, hey, a flight there is expensive, guys. But I really, I want to go to the Serengeti. Oh my goodness me. I want to Serengeti in Tanzania. Yeah, I would love to go there. But hey, when I look at that ticket, I'm like, and then of course it's going to cost me to get into.
And for me, I also envy the big falls.
Oh, you have to. And you have to come and see Victoria Falls on the Zim side during the rainy season. Don't go to the Zambian side. No offense to my Zambian. I love you, Zambians. but you'll see the most. We went there end of last year. It wasn't the rainy season, but it was still just as spectacular. And here's the horrible part of it. This is from me. I'm a Zimbabwean. I left Zimbabwe when I was 25. I had never been to Vic Falls. How many of us in our individual countries have not been? Yeah. Great Zimbabwe was that trip when I went to Vic Falls. I also went to Great Zimbabwe. And my children were like, wow, because they were born here. And they were like, we didn't know. All we see in Zimbabwe, every time I go to Zim, my kids are like, oh, we want to go back home, Mom. I'm like, no, but this is your home. Like, no. Look at the roads. There are holes everywhere when you're driving. You can't drive properly in this country, So that's also the other thing, is that they don't have that connection at all to, a place that is home to me, right? This is their home. This is what they know. And a lot of us in similar situations where, we can't go back to our countries. We've got, all these amazing natural wonders, right? Victoria Falls is a natural wonder. We've got the mountains and everything. But we don't advertise this to the rest of the world. Yes, Darrington. Did I see another hand?
The idea of dominance. Victoria Falls, the history of it is that it was discovered by the British. How can we say we discover something
that was there?
Yes.
But there's a community. There's a community living there.
Yes.
They even gave it a name. Musia Tuni. They smoke that plant.
Smoke that.
And then it comes and says, oh, I've discovered this.
Yeah.
And then it gives the name of the queen.
Victoria. Or even Victoria, what's the V&A waterfront? It's named after the king and queen, right?
Well, that's their country. Cape Town is their country.
And so, and you're quite right, because there's a massive statue at Victoria Falls. And when you read it, it says David Livingstone discovered this and he brought civilization to the the locals that were there or something like that.
It had lost an opportunity when the likes of my leader here were driving fees must fall. I had him counting himself into that group. I think our country lost the opportunity back then. They should have just destroyed the apartheid legacy once and for all. Deal with it. We wouldn't be having people who are bad mouthing us in America right now because they are part of that legacy.
Yeah, and for me, it's important that this indigenous knowledge is passed on to our children, regardless of where they decide to settle. They should know their history, right? But unfortunately, what we find is within most of our countries, our children are all aspiring to leave. They want to go overseas, because that's where life will be better for them. They don't, if you ask them about their history, they're not being taught this history in schools. Our curriculums are, the history of Africa is told from the perspective of the victor, and not the actual people that lived through this, that can tell you that, actually, during this time, we had this A and B and C, and, things were going really well for us. No one will believe, my children won't believe me if I tell them that Africa used to be a really thriving continent. For them, all they see is what they see on the social media.
Yes, Prof. I think to not divert, but to direct this conversation back to the center of what we are discussing here. We can again go back to institutions. So, in the context, for instance, of South Africa, what happened for the most part is that after 1994, there was no program of reconstituting institutions, because I read here that institutions reflect the government's what the government is about. So there was no program like that, such that what was given focus more to was assimilating the majority of people who were excluded into what existed. And then what you then get in that case is you get a situation like we have currently now here in South Africa, where you find now that the form of racism that exists has now been institutionalized. And I live in Cape Town. We have premium form of racism there, not your kind. No, it's premium there, really premium. When we speak of segregated communities there, we speak of real pure segregation, not this form you find anywhere else. And when you look at all of those things, now this is where I'm bringing this to. Their strength now is even more than during apartheid, because they are institutionalized within institutions that are constitutionally recognized. In other words, if, for instance, there is one thing in Cape Town called a glass ceiling, it is difficult to speak to a person who is not of color about a glass ceiling because it's institutionalized. You'll be like, this person will never get this, how I can explain this. But if you speak to another person who experiences it, they get you right as you say it. That's why you have a lot of migration of former, of the, what is the group called when you don't want to say black people, everyone, like black, colored, Indians, what is it called? Previously disadvantaged groups. We have them moving a lot, especially to Gauteng in their numbers, because there is that glass ceiling that is that has been created, and there is a reflection of institutional legacy that was not confronted or decolonized to reflect a new dispensation that you are saying now we are in. And included in that, it's how also these institutions displaced, because going back to the same slides here, we learned that institutions are not really only the constructs under constitutionalism, but they are also the values, the ways of life, the cultures of the people. Now, back in my rural area in the Eastern Cape, there we had a full-blown, luckily my rural area is one of the last to be touched. I don't know if it's luckier or not, but we are one of the last to be touched by this modern civilization, if I can put it that way. So in my time when I was growing up, there were still forms of bartering. My father, for instance, only planted 2 forms of agricultural produce and bartered for every other form, literal bartering. And then you have a law. And in those areas, you would term them some rehabs to an extent, because people who were not listening and towing the line in the urban areas were told, we'll take you back to your rural areas. And when they went back there, they would come back changed because of the institutions there, which are in the culture, the values and the principles and everything else. And then now those were in conflict with the legal institutions which carry a Western view. And then they displaced literally everything that identified the people there. And now as we speak, we have a drug pandemic now, even in rural areas. And we cannot control and enforce law in rural areas because your enforcement will be against the legal enforcement that these other institutions came with. So there is an undermining of ways of life that existed and kept people together for centuries. I mean, if you look at this even in medicine, Western and African medicine, how do you think a people survived? So we survived even their forms of pandemics without their medicines. How did we survive all of that if we were not able to have our own medicines? But then, if you want our own medicine and take it with registered with SAPRA and whoever, all the best in doing so.
So let's get into the institutional legacies that came with our Westerners, which will link to what you are saying. So if we carry on, so for a brief moment, so I did show, and I was like, no, I have to highlight this. There was a brief moment during that era where Africa was richer than the rest of the world. The first one, it's with its colonizers, with the colonial powers, Western Europe, and then I also put the Western offshoots, which is where the Westerners settled. And then here it's with the rest of the world, and you can see during that same period, Africa was relatively rich. So evidence in the literature has linked political centralization to current economic development, right? So there is quite a lot of evidence that the pre-colonial institutions that were in place in Africa during this time, they actually they contributed to the economic they were contributing to the economic progress of Africa during that time. And you can still see some of that effect lingering in current levels of development, right? So several studies show that regions where you had more centralized political structures, right, that were run at a state level, they were better equipped to foster economic development than some of the regions or the kingdoms, the smaller kingdoms where they were run at a village level. So their pre-colonial institutions are actually linked to current education outcomes, literacy outcomes, infrastructure as well as reduced infant mortality. Like you were saying, we had medicine, so we knew how we were already kind of had the means to ensure the livelihoods of newborn babies as well, right? Several of these studies discuss the impact or the mechanism linking political centralization to development, right? So they say the process of this pre-colonial centralization was that it led to the legitimacy of your local leaders during that time, the local government institutions, such that more centralized groups were able to introduce innovations, right? So your state institutions were fostering innovation, and they were able to coordinate their populations or government activities better than the non-centralized regions. So Africa was in this state of state building as well, right? And this links to what you were talking about yesterday, about how institutions organize your labor and the inputs of production. And this was actually happening. You had some of those states that were already in the process of organizing their population and organizing the inputs that they had during that time and the technology that they had during that time to progress, right? Unfortunately, so this is just a map, Murdoch's map. It's not, it's been questioned, but for now, because it's difficult to, no one has yet actually tried to, find a way to measure political centralization. So we still use Murdoch's map, but this just shows where you had your centralized kingdoms and where they were less centralized. So a 0 indicates societies lacking any form of centralized political institution. So this will be the white. The 1 indicates small chiefdoms, and then the higher you go, it means you're becoming a more centralized state with a large government. Unfortunately, the literature then states that ethnicities that lacked state-like institutional mechanisms, this unfortunately left them vulnerable to when the Westerners came in. And so the colonial administration, when it came in and it installed their own paramount chiefs from the local people, they would install their own leaders and use those leaders to sort of push forward their agenda. What happened was that when decolonization happened, that became the main sort of mechanism that remained in some of these less centralized states. And this is what you find happening today, is that you still have this type of patronage politics taking place, where the institutions that then were put in place by the colonizers, that mechanism has remained in place, right? So your state formation was, the state formation processes were interrupted by the arrival of Westerners, right? And they brought with them the influence of missionaries. There was the slave trade, and there was colonialism. The unfortunate thing is that these events coincided at a critical time in Africa's period, and these events either dismantled the pre-colonial institutions that were in place, or they replaced them with colonial institutions, replacing them with colonial. So they dismantled and replaced them with colonial institutions, or, because some of the especially the British colonizers, they liked indirect rule. So they would use these pre-existing political hierarchy to rule indirectly, right? And what that meant was that the local leaders became less accountable to their citizens and more accountable to the colonial administration. So you're losing the trust and the integrity of your local citizens. Whereas previously, before all of this, when you were building your state, it was building that integrity in your local leaders. And because you had trust in your local leaders, you were towing the line. You were agreeing with the government, say, okay, yes, you are right. Let's build this. Let's invest in infrastructure. Yes, you're right. Let's ensure that pregnant women are taken care of so that when they give birth to children, the children survive longer. You were towing the line. But unfortunately, we were still in the process of developing these institutions, of forming these institutions, and then we were hit by these historical events. And the unfortunate thing is that they coincided, they overlapped, right? So you had your slave trade. And then as you are just recovering from the slave trade, you still have some lingering countries that still have, you know, the slave trade. The Westerners decided to expand their influence and go inland into Africa. And then now, you know, what we were talking about, that sometimes your investments are then having to be used for non-productive activity. So this is what was happening. The investments that these African countries were putting towards state building, they now had to use them to fight off an enemy. So your capital now is going to a non-productive activity, and it's not going into the productive activities. So this is where we find ourselves, right? Okay, so the first shock to Africa was the slave trade, and this map shows you the critical slave trade routes. So you can see West to Central Africa were really affected by the slave trade. They were going to Western Europe, they were going to Northern America, they were going to South America. You also have a trade route here going to Asia on the Indian Ocean, and then you also have within trans-Saharan slave trade going to North Africa as well. So they were also involved in the slave trade. But obviously the Atlantic slave trade was, the transatlantic slave trade was the largest slave trade, and half of the population in Africa was lost due to the slave trade during that era. Initially, the trade was state organized, right? The trade was, it involved state organized raids and warfare. However, as the trade became lucrative within Africa, ethnic tribes started to turn on each other, including neighboring tribes, friends and family members. There was a lot of kidnapping of either neighboring tribes or even people within your own tribe, and selling each other into slavery. Enslaved people were then sold to the slave merchants in return for imported goods and guns that you can use to go and enslave more people. Hence the gun-slave cycle, right? Although they make it seem like this gun-slave cycle was mutually beneficial, but if you think about it, maybe it was a question of, if you don't find slaves for us, we will take your people. So you kind of were forced to take the guns if you wanted to be victorious against a neighboring tribe, right? So example, they give an example, Sierra Leone. Approximately 40% of slaves were kidnapped, 25% enslaved through warfare, 20% enslaved by family and friends, and 16% as a slave of judicial processes. So if you were a criminal, you were caught for stealing food, you were sold as a slave. This graph shows so you can get this data on slave trade on the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database. So there is data if you want to do anything within this literature. The blue is the total number of slaves that left the countries, and then the red is the total number of slaves that disembarked. So you can see that more slaves left countries, but by the time they got to where they were going, Portugal, Great Britain, Netherlands, some had died during the crossing of the transatlantic. And you can see your biggest traders of slave were Portugal, Brazil, Great Britain, France, and Spain. And those are the big slave traders. And then they also became the big colonizers as well, right? So the slave trades created inter and intra-group mistrust. And there is, so you'll see that in these slides, I've put a lot of literature. It's at the end as well. I've tried to capture most of the references that I was using. But these are very interesting papers, and some are books as well. These are very interesting references if you're interested in this field, economic history. It's still such a niche field, so it would be nice if more of us were doing more evidence-based research in economic history to show how it has shaped Africa today, because it really helps to put a lot of issues, all the stuff that we're debating, into better perspective, and it will also help as well when we're, again, you know, it's always about our policies and reforming our institutions. If you have context, you can come up with better, or you can implement better policies as well. Another form of slavery that was taking place. So this slavery on the transatlantic was mainly for labor, because you were going to work on the sugar plantations, cotton plantations, right? And also by, you know, the islands here. The one on the Indian Ocean was, their type of enslavement was as a result of debt. So men would be indebted, and they would resolve to pay off debt through enslavement of their wives or children. So they would send them over to Asia as to work in the houses, right? So what you find with slave trade is that there was a gender ratio imbalance that occurred. In here, more men left. So the gender ratio imbalance was that in West African countries, you had more women to men that were left in the countries. Here, more women were traded, so you find that there was that gender imbalance that was created during that era due to, and so you had more men than women there, right? And there's literature evidence that shows that because it skewed the gender ratios in African countries, it is associated with increased prevalence of polygamy in West Africa, because there were too many women to men left, and also higher HIV infection rates among women today, right? Again, because of the polygamy as well. Slave trade diminished social conduct. It destroyed social capital in Africa, within and amongst and between ethnic tribes. That was just one of the worst things that, apart from losing your labor, losing your productive labor, we lost social capital. And we all know that when you lose trust, even with your own friend or your own brother, how long does it take you to actually build that trust where you can say, okay, fine, I trust you? It's very difficult. It's a long run factor that takes a long time to evolve the social conduct. So this caused political instability and conflict, obviously, because you've lost the social capital. It's also contributed to the existing inequalities we have within Africa. So what happened as well during this time is those bigger centralized kingdoms, they obviously had more resources. So what did they do? They would take slaves from the less or the smaller kingdoms. So they became rich because of the slave trade, while the smaller kingdoms became poorer because they were losing their labor to the bigger centralized countries. So it created labor shortages in some countries. So they give the example of the kingdom of Dahomey, where it's one of the largest kingdoms in Benin. It was an organized domestic economy. It was built not only on their wars, their tribal wars, but also on the slave trade. They also became a great nation because of the slave trade in exchange for weapons or coerced labor from neighboring countries, which they would use that labor, either sell it on to the slave owners, or they would use that labor to work in their farms in their royal plantations, supplying food to the army and the military in the kingdom of Dahomey. Of course, with every literature, there are always two sides to a story. So exactly as I was saying now, there were some countries did benefit from the slave trade, right? So there is evidence that find that in some Western countries, the women are more engaged in political activities because of the slave trade. So they say because the men were taken during the slave trade, women had to step into these male-dominated roles. So you find that they are more engaged in political participation in certain Western African countries. I'm thinking of Nigeria here. I can see the head is down, but I hear that Nigerian women are very dominant. And this might be one of the reasons why they are very dominant as well. So that was the slave trade. And then as the slave trade was, they were coming up and they were like, okay, no, this is really bad. We need to abolish the slave trade. But of course, the Westerners still needed resources. And with all this labor they were, with all the labor they were taking, they were progressing at a much faster rate. So they were expanding and they needed resources. And at the same time, the Industrial Revolution was now starting to take place in Western Europe. They needed natural resources as well. So Western powers increased their footprint from the coastlines, from the coastlines where the slaves were. They started going in because they needed natural resources as well, especially since we had said, you know, we're abolishing the selling of labor, right? So they went into the interior of the continent. So this is pre-colonial Africa, right? And then you have the borders that were put in place by the colonial powers at the Berlin Conference. And this was at a time when they had limited knowledge of internal Africa's cultures, customs, and systems of government. So there's this quote by Lord Cecil Salisbury. Salisbury used to be the name of our capital city in Zimbabwe. We changed it to Harare, obviously post-independent. But this is what he said. We have been engaged in drawing lines upon maps where no white man's feet have ever trod. We have been giving away mountains and rivers and lakes to each other, only hindered by the small impediment that we never knew exactly where the mountains and rivers and lakes were, right? So what was the outcome of them drawing these borders? They split ethnic tribes, all right? But at the time when they were splitting the ethnic tribes, us, the locals, were not really concerned. We didn't see any threat, right? So as one king stated, we regard the boundary between Benin and Nigeria as separating the English and French and not the Yoruba tribe. So for them, they thought this was a Western thing. You know, they're just dividing the land because this land is going to the French, this land is going to the English. They didn't think, and they were still able, the borders were porous. So you could still cross over without immigration, without border control or anything. So for them, during that time, they didn't see this as a threat, and they just said, no, leave it like that. Unfortunately, those borders have persisted to date, and we now know, and we know the issues they are causing, right? So the border petitioning split of tribes, I'll just give you a few examples. The Maasai are petitioned between Kenya and Tanzania. 62% are in Kenya, 32% are in Tanzania. The Anyi between Ghana and Ivory Coast, 58% are in Ghana, right? This is the same tribe. 42% are in Ivory Coast. The Chewa, 50% in Mozambique, 34% in Malawi, 16% in Zimbabwe. Hausa is split between Nigeria and Niger. The Ewe is split between the Togo and Ghana border. So there are a lot of tribes that were split by the borders, right? So the dark lines are all these tiny little things. These were all our ethnic tribes. And then when you put the national boundaries, you can clearly see that they were splitting tribes in Africa. And what was the outcome of that? Well, here we are, right? When people ask me how do I identify, I'll say I'm a Zimbabwean. You say you're a South African. You say you're a Mozambican. All of you here, when I was asking, you said, I'm from Nigeria, I'm from here. You didn't say I'm from the Yoruba tribe. I didn't tell you I'm from the Shona tribe. You didn't tell me you're from the Zulu tribe or the Xhosa tribe. You said you were from South Africa. You said you were from Nigeria. So now we identify by the colonial national borders and not by our tribes. So why do you think there's conflict, ethnic conflict in Africa? So the theory with the ethnic partitioning that has been put forward in the literature is that it split these groups. And what it did is that the split ethnic groups were often used by neighboring countries to stage proxy wars and destabilize the government on the other side, right? So if you were a minority, and also the other thing is, if you were the minority tribal group within this national border, you were also marginalized in terms of investments, right? And because you are marginalized, the dominant group that is in the other country buys your fight. And then there's conflict, right? And it's a conflict now between, it's not a conflict between tribes, it's a conflict between two countries. It's a conflict between two countries, right? So this is one of the mechanisms of the colonial legacies that we were left behind with. What, with our colonial, it's important for us to understand their settlement patterns and how they ruled as well. So Westerners migrated in mass to places with good environment, right? An absence of endemic diseases. They had low population densities. So if you think of North America, Australia, South Africa, Zimbabwe, these, where they settled, they installed inclusive institutions, and we were known as settler plantation colonies. So this is where the Europeans settled in their numbers, right? Low settlement of Europeans what happened in where the Europeans were dying in great numbers, right? So they couldn't acclimatize to West African climate, to a lot of Central African climate, so they couldn't settle there. So they established only very small communities, and they would just extract institutions. So these were called settler concession colonies, right? And the main objective in these particular type of colonies was to extract and ship the minerals. So you'll find that a lot of your settler colonies will be along your coastal lines, because you could easily ship the minerals and agricultural goods to the mother country, right? And we still observe that type of trade pattern, right? Where we still ship agricultural goods, we still ship raw minerals to the colonial powers, right? Why didn't we change that when at the end of the colonial era? Post-colonial, we're still following the same trade patterns. And this is what we find ourselves in. Yes, you had your hand up. Oh no, you were just making, all right, I get you, yes.
Yeah, Prof. This is interesting. I find this literature, I engage it a lot. I find it there's something called epistemological colonialism. I find a problem with the framing of our history by academia and how they go about it. And this epistemological colonialization is what is seen even now with your AI and its aggregation and biases that are within. So I'm saying this for my colleagues here to just pay attention to it.
Yeah.
I'm gonna make an example, a quick one, and then I'm done with this point. On what you said, Prof, which is basically, it's not you, it's literature.
The literature.
Regarding the benefits or beneficial part of the slave trade. For me, that on its own is triggering. I don't get how academia allows it in that sense, but I also know the reviewers of these journals are not of African descent too by their numbers and would never take exception to such things. But now, I just quickly said on ChatGPT, on purpose, because I know this epistemological colonization exists in the biases found in these two. I said the benefits of the Holocaust. Now, this is what it says. The Holocaust was one of the most horrific genocides in human history, involving the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others by Nazi Germany. Any suggestion that it had benefits is extremely controversial, morally problematic, and widely condemned. I haven't done the same experiment. I want to ask about King Leopold, who killed 13 million Africans. This guy here, Hitler, killed 6 million Jews. And on purpose, I'm not saying only, because those are human lives. I can't say only 6 million Jews. But this same experiment, side to side, when I ask the same question about King Leopold, you'll get a very, very triggering response from that. So what I'm saying is, for most part of our history and how it is framed, you find that we are being dehumanized. Maybe since we're also wholesale traded, there's no difference between a stone and an African. And that is all.
And yeah, I like what you've said, because as we continue discussing this, you will see exactly what you're talking about, the framing, that, there's always, they're always trying to find a way of, highlighting that, well, it wasn't all so bad, And there's an interesting paper by Robinson and Heldring, where he's looking at the counterfactual, and he says it doesn't matter whatever sort of positives you say Africa got from, colonialism and etc. At the end, he says the adverse effects were much worse than if Africa had just been left alone. That's exactly what, and that paper, I will add it, I'll put it there for you guys to read.
Yeah,
Oh, sorry, I could add, then I'll come.
Part for argument's sake. I mean, the Holocaust was really good because Nazi Germany experimented with people, and we have advancement in medicine now because he experimented with Jews.
Yeah.
That is insensitive.
Exactly.
That is insulting.
It's insensitive, right?
You can say that,
Yeah.
right? So they should respect us. That is what I wanted to say.
No, I still add on to what it's saying that, they will try to find the positive
Yes.
in negative they hit, right? I was having a chat the other year with, person with a different kind of mind. And they were discussing each of them. And I was saying, look, we're actually discussing land reform from our country. I was taking this justified intellectual groups. controversial as it might be, and he's saying on one page, he's saying that, I think, well, this is our land, we have the regional inhabitants of this country. And they're saying, oh, but you moved away the oil or the sand. So he's saying, well, then tit for tat, you move them away from that, and they also do the same thing. So I'm just thinking a lot, you know.
Exactly. They will always, you know, there seems to be this narrative to try and make it seem like they didn't engage in horrific activities during that time. So even the King Leopold, when you read about it, it's horrible what he did to the Congolese people during that time, right? But you'll see, I've got an example of how they frame it, right? So they'll say, yes, it was bad, but yes, this was happening, right? And you're thinking, still, and even what you were saying about the slave trade. So I was having this discussion with a certain person in my life. I won't mention who, because Mary will be on my case. And I was saying, you know, there's evidence that you know, there was good that came out of these historical events. And then he's like, he was like, but if you look at what they're saying were the benefits, were they really beneficial to that country? You know, if you think about that they're saying, well, you know, Kingdom of Dahomey gained from the wealth of the slave trade. But he says, they were still poor in relation to the people that were actually taking the labor, you know. And when you look at it, they haven't been able to catch up, to grow their economies to the same. So if you're saying, yes, they were using slave labor, how come they're still poor today and they're not as rich as Western Europe, who are also using the labor? So clearly you are saying no, but then there was no benefits to these countries. So you cannot say that they benefited from a historical event, they benefited from the slave trade and all of that. So yeah, it's a very interesting debate. And we shall continue it, because I can see it's almost it's almost lunchtime. So we will continue this after lunch. We'll discuss more about our colonial legacies. And yeah, so yeah. Good. Yeah. It's lunch.